Now on to session one, China's technological advancement, its innovation model and philosophy. We will welcome Chandran back to moderate this panel. We are delighted to have Mr. Pascal Coppens, Professor Josef Mahoney, and Ms. Peggy Liu on our panel today. If you have any questions for our panelists or the moderator, please enter them in the Q&A box below. Chandran, I will now hand over the stage to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you, Rohan. And I'd really like to thank the three speakers before, Prachi, Ian, and Brian. I thought that was a wonderful session. I could have listened to them for another 25 minutes or so. And, you know, we experimented this time by not having a keynote. So we thought we'd bring three young people under 30 and say, and listen to what they had to say. And I think they did an immense job. So now it's my pleasure to host three experts. To my panel, distinguished panel members, the bar is rather high. The first panel set that, so I hope you're all up to the challenge. I'm sure you will be, and I'm going to enjoy moderating this session as your humble moderator. I'll try and stay out of the way. You do the talking, enlighten all of us, and I'll try and make sense of some of it by asking a few questions. So just a very quick introduction. I'm very pleased that the first speaker, the first person I'd like to introduce is Pascal Coppens. And you can all see his resumes if you're interested today in the age of technology. But just to say, Pascal is an expert in China, lived in China a long time. He's back in Europe at the moment, wrote two very good books, which I'm going to plug for you, Pascal, China's New Normal and We Trust China. So Pascal, thank you for joining. Second, I'd like to introduce Professor Josef Gregory, who is again an expert on China, lived in China a long time. And I'm not going to read all his distinguished achievements and affiliations. You can all go and check it. Just trust me. He knows his stuff, been in China a long time. And as we always try and do with these panels, we try and bring people who are the first panel who know China, but are not simply, you know, from China. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so Professor Josef Gregory fits that bill extremely well. And last but not least, my good friend for many years ago, Peggy. Peggy, long time no see. How you doing? Well, so Peggy started something which was one of the earliest organizations, I think, in China that looked at the joint US-China collaboration for clean energy. And I think the first time I met you, Peggy, was perhaps about 15 or 20 years ago. And you were going on about this stuff, and you were going on with this stuff. And I said, well, I hope this really works. And my God, we need joint US-China collaboration more than ever. So more power to you. And I hope you're not giving up your agency, as Brian said, and that you're going to plug on. So let's start right into the discussion. For the audience, the kind of questions that we really ask the panel to address are, I can frame as following. How has China reached its current stage of development and its leading position in technological advantages? So much is not said about this, the innovation, and all of it, many of us speak about East-West innovation, but I hope our panel members will provide some insights into the differences in the Chinese tech ecology, if I can call that, and probe into that a bit more. And how will it maintain its position? Second, what is the Chinese approach on principles of innovation? How do Chinese companies operate, given that there's an interface with the state as well, which in itself then turns out into accusations at a geopolitical level that they are state-run companies and all of that. And many of you, the three panelists who know Chinese firms much better than me, but I know a bit about them, will know many of them are not simply arms of the state as well, if you've been to some of their facilities. So what are the principles of Chinese innovation and intellectual property? How do they navigate all of that? And how does it sit in the role of digesting the role of business and technology in a society like China, which is very different from other societies as well? And then how does China's innovation model differ from other industrial leaders. What are the unique policies, business structures, and philosophies, and the education system as well? And finally, we'd like to also, get the panel members to give us a bit of insight from their experience. Well, how will they contribute? How will these technologies and these companies and the owners of these technologies in China continue to disseminate their technology worldwide? This goes back to the second conference we had, where we talked about China's role in creating a shared prosperous humanity, the common prosperity angle, etc. And how would China contribute to the world as well in this regard? Will it be a plus? Are there threats? What are those things? And in the spirit of this conference, I'd like to urge the panelists to say what they think. We are interested in a robust discussion, fair and open. So let me stop there and invite Pascal to make the opening remarks. Pascal, over to you. Please take about 4 or 5 minutes to lay your cart out, tell us what you think, and then I'll invite the second person, and then we can have a robust discussion. Over to you, Pascal.
Thank you, Chandran. So I'd like to start my my opening remarks basically talking about how I feel that we are changing the way outside of China, specifically in Europe, where I'm from, and in America, in the West, as you can call it, in how we look at Chinese innovation. And I feel that there's 3 main blind spots that we are encountering these days. If we go back in time, and as you said very well, I've been in China for a long time. For 35 years, I've been involved in China, 20 years lived there, and I've been part of the innovation train of China from the early days. Myself being an innovator at that point in Shanghai, I really felt that when you look at the outside world, most of the people looked at China, specifically from Europe, people that I know very well, with kind of a hubris and a feeling that innovation is really something that is being created very much in Europe, in America, in Silicon Valley. This is where the cradle of innovation is. It's about finding new ideas, being very creative, and ultimately coming up with breakthrough things that can change the world. And so this is a hubris way that we've been looking at it, but China proved us wrong. They can actually innovate. This is something that I knew 20 years ago. It took most people a lot longer to figure that out, and mostly when they were confronted with the competition of Chinese going global at one point. And so I feel that then it went more into fear rather than into hubris, meaning that we're now worried about this Chinese innovation and we can't put our hand around it or our head around it, and we don't really understand how it works. And I think we have 3 blind spots. The first one is that most of the narratives that I have followed in the media globally is pretty much a top-down narrative. It's always Beijing, it's the party, it's basically driven innovation. And we in Europe, in Silicon Valley, we don't believe that top-down innovation can work. It never breaks through really into society. This is how we view it very often. Because of that, my experience is that we are disregarding the grassroots bottom-up innovation that is so powerful in China that I've been part of for 20 plus years. So that's the first blind spot that I see. The second one I see is that we have more and more of this narrative about quantity or capacity or overcapacity being driven towards the European and American markets, towards the developed countries. And the result of that is that we're thinking that capacity is something that is good in a way that it can scale, but first you need quality. And if you don't have the quality, the capacity and the quality, and it's just a price war, and it doesn't really help anyone. And so what we're forgetting, in my view, is that the Chinese business model, and we can talk about that later, is very much a quantity to quality direction rather than a quality to quantity, which is very much a Western-driven innovation model. And the Chinese increase the quality over time. And the last blind spot I want to talk about is that most of the topics we are addressing when it comes to China is the economic challenges that China has. Societal, systemic challenges, geopolitical challenges, all these huge disruptions that are happening that we didn't have like 5 or 10 years ago as much, is now creating a narrative, in my view, where we're totally forgetting that actually China is very much aware of the challenges that they have. And it's not about solving these challenges, it's actually that they've put innovation at the center of their master plan to ultimately increase the growth of the economy moving forward with new drivers of the economic growth. And that's called the new quality productive forces, but that's a mouthful. But it's all about really using innovation to change the status quo and change the way that the economy is running. And so we're looking at a door that is closing with the economy. We're looking at peaking, at failing economy, and we should look at the key rather than the door. And I think that's my opening statement.
Pascal, great. Really, you know, a lot of food for thought. I particularly liked the Chinese version of quantity driving quality rather than the other way. And that's a good bit of insight for everyone to think. Before I move on to Professor, I got one question that maybe you could take 1 minute to just expand on so that the others can reflect on. I particularly like your point about China's quality development issue and the pause, if you want to call it, in the drive for double-digit economic growth, et cetera, is seen by the rest of the world as some kind of failure. And you are saying that there's actually great innovation being put in place at the center, and you talked about the key in the door. Can you point to one or two things that you see that door will open towards? What will that look like, perhaps, in the next 10 years? And I'm only
in the next
1 minute.
No, it's okay. I mean, I could talk a long time about it, but in the next 10 years, there's three main things that the government has pointed out, and as an entrepreneur myself, I've experienced very much. It's first of all the upgrading of traditional industries that need to happen. And there was never any room to do that in the past because it was all about surviving first. And so I think the upgrade of new industry, the upgrade of traditional industries, when we talk about logistics or we talk about anything related to manufacturing or so on, that is what's really driving today. They need to play on a global level playing field. The second thing is new industries, very interesting topic, which has most of the attention from the world, electrical vehicles and flying cars and all these things. But this is China first time realizing that they can compete at a global level in new things. And then there's the discoveries or future technologies that we're not watching at all. And I think that's where China could really excel because of the talent that they've created.
Thank you, Pascal. Really very, very useful. Set the scenes for a good discussion going forward. Next, can I invite Professor Mahoney to share his insights? I think as someone who's traveled academia, policymaking, business, and lived in China a long time. So Professor Mahoney, over to you and your initial thoughts, please.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. I hope I live up to the standards established by those who preceded me. I was particularly interested in some of the earlier discussions with the earlier panel as they relate to climate change, and I think that'll become apparent given some of my opening statement. My main purpose is to discuss China's rise as an advanced technological society and what this distinction means and provide some examples of the same. Now, I've argued elsewhere in several publications that China has perhaps already surpassed all of the countries as an advanced technological society. Now, this doesn't mean that China is an absolute leader in technology development or even key technologies. Rather, in my definition, China as a society outperforms all others in its capacity to lead, develop, and employ effective technological solutions to both major and minor problems affecting society and promoting national and even global well-being. Now, this is accomplished through the alignment and mobilization of political and economic interest coupled with popular support. And it's in this milieu that we see the rapid advance of what Beijing calls high-quality productive forces, the proliferation of smart cities, smart ports, smart mines, and so on. And of course, we realize that China is the world's most advanced industrial system. It's a world leader in logistics and shipping, still the cornerstone of many supply chains. Now, I don't want to sort of go against what was previously said. Certainly, we do see a separation between the state and the private sector, but we also see them working hand in hand, not where one is directing the other for securitization, but where we see the desire to support each other through co-development. And of course, we see other countries that are following China's lead. We can point to one, Ethiopia. I think others were mentioned in the previous panels that have accelerated their own development, copying to some extent China's model as a technological society. And I think in the case of Ethiopia, given some of the research done by my friend Max Meyer in Bonn, that Ethiopia is currently outpacing Germany. Now, I'll also discuss the strategic implications of China's development as an advanced technological society from both Chinese and global perspectives, and discuss the relevance of these developments for climate change with a focus on green development and the blue economy in tandem with massive ecological conservation and recovery projects underway in China today. Now, because I've already signaled that concerns about climate change occupy a privileged place here, I'd like to begin with a reference to my fieldwork in Ukraine last summer in support of my thesis that the conflict there is in part a proxy war between two fossil fuel dependent economies fighting over energy markets and how energy is paid for. Now, this is a contest in my analysis between absolute adversaries, and I think many people can see this. But I also assess the US and Russia are complicit adversaries. In other words, adversaries who are both benefiting from the same fight, in so much as both sides appear to be playing the strategic endgame with respect to climate change, and both sides achieving key objectives despite the high costs they have likewise incurred, not only from this conflict, but also from climate change itself. However, these costs are relative to those borne by the global South, and above all, China, are much smaller, and hence the game or the end game. Now, recently, I was also in northern Greece among the scorched hillsides from wildfires, observing a port where a recent high Chinese bid was blocked by the U.S. Pressure on the government in Athens, and that port's now being used to offload heavy weapons destined for Ukraine. And as I traveled to Komotini, I observed new pipelines going north into Bulgaria to provide alternatives to Russian-sourced energy. And of course, if you follow the news today, you'll see the damage of wildfires in Los Angeles. But I think it's important to recall that in 2023, the year of fire, carbon emissions from wildfires exceeded those from those produced by burning fossil fuels. Now, analysts today believe that the future of global security will be determined in the North and South poles. The U.S. keeps missile subs under the ice for first strike and counterstrike capabilities, but such advantages are melting away with the melting ice. More recently, Trump's flirtation with the possibility of using economic or even military coercion to acquire Greenland or Canada might or might not be a bit of a ruse or a joke, but it's clear this idea is not something new. It's long been part of strategic thinking, given global warming, and given his own comments on the subject, we can see that he likewise understands the climate change link. And as we reflect on the change happening in Washington next week, let's recall that the Biden administration did more against the environment than he did for it. We could not imagine Biden would open protected lands in Alaska drilling and consolidate America's position as the world leader in petroleum production, something no Republican president ever had the courage to do. But we do know that Trump will certainly make matters worse, repeating in one form or another the anti-climate agenda from his first presidential term. Now, a careful study of China today will indicate that the biggest risk on its horizon is not whether it will find itself stuck in a middle-income trap. It's not about challenges in the South China Sea or the Taiwan issue. It's not whether its political system can continue to adapt to meet the needs of a changing world. It's not even whether China can find solutions to what Xi Jinping has referred to as America's attempt to impose a technology blockade. Indeed, all of these problems, however substantial, are in many respects easier to address than many of the much bigger problems China has already solved since the founding of the PRC. Rather, I believe the largest problem facing China, and not just China, it is climate change. And in fact, several studies have concluded that China is the country most at risk due to these problems in terms of exposed fixed assets and populations, experiencing desertification in the north and northwest, all the way up to Beijing, and increasing exposure to coastal threats in Shandong, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and the Greater Bay Area of Guangdong and Hong Kong. So we see China's dramatic moves to bring more green innovation to its economy and to lead on blue economic development. These are not merely opportunistic. They're not merely popular for middle-income populations in key cities demanding a higher quality of life. It's also essential for addressing this existential crisis threatening China's survival and the rest of the world. And indeed, if you scratch deep enough, you can find it connected to most of the conflicts that we find going on in the world today. Now, I know that I've opened a little long. I would just like to leave with a little provocative point. We have this question in scholarship related to the Needham paradox. Why didn't China, for example, during the Ming Dynasty, accelerate the capacities that it had and develop its own scientific and industrial revolutions? And instead, we see the collapse of the Ming and then a retrograde dynasty following with the Qing, and then the crisis of modernity that follows in terms of the conflict with the rising West. One of the things that we point to is the Ice Age, how this threw off production, agricultural production, which further weakened the Ming, and problems related to silver. Silver coming out of Mexico, which undermined the Ming economy. There were other problems, but these are two issues. And there are also deeper cultural reasons why China might not have developed in the same way that the West did. But here in the new era, we're also facing a problem related to climate change, global warming, and we also face the challenge of the continuing role of the dollar and China's the way that China instrumentalizes the value of the dollar, in so much as China doesn't want to expose its own currency. So thinking about these problems in the context of China's rise as an advanced technological society, I think that what we're looking at are a large number of coalescing efforts to deal with conservation, recovery, but also the development of new technologies that will be able to allow China to survive this new era of great power competition, which I believe is in one way or another centered on climate change and the need to address that problem.
Professor Gregory, you covered huge range of issues there. And I've got a million questions to ask, well, to learn from your answers. But let me start with one. But you opened up this whole discussion about you feel the centrality of technology in terms of dealing with existential threats. And I'd like to explore that a bit more as you see in the Chinese context. But to frame that initially, just to have a quick response from you, at the start you said that, and I think this is really important for an international audience, as Pascal said, so many in Europe and dare I say the United States, et cetera, and parts of Asia just don't understand what's necessarily happening. And you said that China has surpassed many other countries, but you qualified by the saying that that doesn't mean that they have the best technologies in the world, et cetera. But I think the part that I found most interesting, and I thought you could just amplify it a bit more, was when you said what China did was show that it had the capacity to essentially lead and leverage and use technology. And very importantly, if I'm not misquoting you, you said to use technology for society and well-being. Do you think that's very much central to the way the central government in China looks at the role of technology in society, that it is to essentially unleash the power of the technology to create a society, the technology that serves society and its well-being?
Well, I think President Xi has underscored the problem of what we might call the historical technology gap and how that left China vulnerable to foreign competition and aggression back in the 1900s. And he said, quote, "Advanced technology is the sharp weapon of the modern state." An important reason that Western countries were able to hold sway over the world in modern times was that they held the advanced technology. And so we know that China is being forced and has been forced since the 1800s to compete in order to survive and to secure itself and its sovereignty. But the thing that I really want to distinguish here is that the way China began to solve that problem, the crisis of modernity, which is fundamentally a technology gap in terms of where China was in its development versus the West, is that they were able to create a political solution where the CPC was able to recreate itself as a force that was able to modernize China uh, as a technological society. In other words, it was able to bring the masses into the political equation. It was able to accelerate technological development, but more importantly, it was able to integrate the political system, the industry, the people all together to solve big problems. And so, you know, for example, do you have to have the most advanced space program, or is the capacity to land on the dark side of the moon at this stage good enough? Do you have to have the most advanced medical care system, or is it, can we see from China's unrivaled response to the pandemic? You know, what China, as I was a public health officer, an epidemiologist with the CDC in the 1990s in the United States, and what China was able to achieve in terms of containment and control through zero COVID policies, we did not believe, science did not believe was possible. But that was only possible because you had the party using the existing technology, the political system, the government, the people, the various industries, everyone working together to solve that problem. And it wasn't something that merely benefited China. Holding the line in China prevented a more rapid emergence of new mutations. But it was also the case that in 2020, China saved the global economy by restarting production of vital products that people needed in order to survive while they were floundering. So this is what I mean by advanced technological society. And this is what I mean by the system having produced this type of system that is capable of solving these types of problems. Again, we can look at AI. AI in China is lagging a little bit in terms of the most advanced applications that we see in the United States. But when we see the application of AI in smart government and other areas, China is by far in the lead. So the use of technology and how society and government work together, as well as industry, this is where we have to conceptualize a technological society and where China is in the leading position.
Professor Mahoney, profound, extremely useful thoughts, and I think extremely beneficial to the audience to kind of figure out what do we mean by an advanced technological society, almost redefining the framework. Thank you. And now can I invite Peggy to, Peggy, give us a bit of, a bit of what you started off with, where you saw things in China 25 years ago, and where you see the future is in the context of our discussion today. Over to you.
Definitely. And again, thank you, Chandran, for inviting me to talk about China, one of my favorite topics. First, I want to sort of give context as to who I am, because a lot of times I talk and then people are like, oh, wow, you're just a China apologist, or you must be paid by the government to talk about propaganda. But actually, I was born in Michigan, and I spent most of my early life in the US. I only moved to China in 2004, where I live in Shanghai now. And, Pascal talked about innovation hubris. I was part of that Silicon Valley initial entrepreneurship, internet rush. So when I talk about China, I really feel like I am viewing it from both an American set of eyes, as well as my experience on the ground in China, helping accelerate clean energy, helping introduce smart grid, helping build first curriculum for mayors across China on eco-cities, etc. So balance is the name of the game. And nuance, I think, is also very important when you're looking at China and how it's motivated to move forward, whether it's collaborating or competing. So with that, I want to say, I think one of the interesting points about why China is innovating so fast right now is the motivation is about safety and security. I mean, think about the recent history of poverty, of basically all rural development, and now, now we're able to have everybody, almost everybody fed, right? So safety and security, I think, is the primary motivation. It's not about competition or military dominance. Whereas I think in my birth country, America, it really is about, winning the game. I think China is much more balanced. Two, I think China has a very unique ability to focus. And because its leaders are sort of in place in one seat for about 10 years, it's able to drive that focus in the longer term and not be sort of swayed, this sort of seesaw and this back and forth tug of war between two different people or multiple parties' focuses. I think uniquely, it's able to identify what I call acupressure points of change. So for example, when I first started joint US-China collaboration on clean energy, that was really the first push for clean tech in China. It really came out of this conference that I put together called the MIT Forum on the Future of Energy in China, and then just sort of exploded this interest in this new technology. And then very shortly after I finished that conference, the US and China government really pushed me. I mean, they really pushed me to start this nonprofit. I was very happily a venture capitalist at the time. But I dropped my job and I said, okay, this is too big of an issue. I'm going to spend 10 years of my life to help China change its trajectory on climate change. And so the US government actually had me bring in smart grid technologies into China in 2007. At the time, there wasn't even the term smart grid in China. But because China was able to really, really double down, lean in to these things like smart grid, this acupressure change really has multidimensional effect across China and beyond. Two is, I think it has this political will that a lot of countries don't have. So the ability to say, we're gonna peak carbon emissions by 2030, they're gonna do it. The ability to say, hey, we're gonna go carbon neutral by 2060. We don't know how to do it, but we're gonna do it by 2060. That is political will that very few countries have. Most importantly, I think China has an ability now to create from the future and not the past. It's not about making China great again. It's about every single city have an urban planning museum that shows the city 20 years from now. What is it going to look like? It's about the China dream. That's actually a project that I started in 2010 to reimagine prosperity for China, and then Xi Jinping somehow picked it up and it became the national slogan of China. But it really is this mentality of not being stuck in the past, not griping about what we lost, but just leaping forward, right? So focus on the future. Two is, I think it has this really unique ability to scale. So one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that China has mandatory government training of 12 days mandatory training per year if you're part of the government. And I know because I used to train at the National Academy for Mayors of China, the China Executive Leadership Academy Pudong, as a professor at the China Academy of Governance, which recently merged with the Party School. And so imagine if China has these new policies that are, just sort of raining down from the sky, they're able to scale this knowledge through mandatory training across the country fairly easily. And I wish every country would be able to do that. The other one is that China uniquely is able to experiment with sustainable technologies at city scale. Now remember, sustainability in anything infrastructure is about very, very large, has to be city scale. It can't be building scale. It cannot be micro. It's about balance, right? It's about ecosystem. China, because it was building cities, right? Like over 1 million people. 1 million people is like really tiny, right? China is actually able to say, okay, we're gonna do smart city pilot in Yangzhou, right? In 9 months, I had worked with the deputy mayor there, the head of the economic zone. In 9 months, I was cutting the ribbon for the first smart city of China. Then, all of a sudden you've got 5, 10 cities that are, pilots, then you've got hundreds of cities that are smart city pilots. So China's really got an edge when it comes to scaling innovation, really key. I also think that this is really important. China is used to change. It's willing to change. It's willing to give up everything it knew, like cash, and within a year, everybody is on digital cash. WeChat Pay, Alipay, like what's cash, right? It does that with policies, it does that with cities, it does that with like every dimension of living in China. And it's willing to tweak, right? It adopts technologies, but it tweaks it, it localizes it really, really quickly. And now what I've seen is that it's really leaning in to R&D, like true R&D. If you can see the nuclear fusion, you can look at green hydrogen, what they're doing there. So I think that combined with billions of dollars of investments in every single technology, what we should be doing is not criticizing China on how many coal plants they, created that moment. They should be looking at momentum. Momentum is so much more important in the longer term than metrics, snapshot metrics. And in fact, what China has is not just linear momentum, it's like tornado momentum, it's angular momentum. Right? And so this is why China has been able to change so quickly. The last one is China has an understanding that industry is about ecosystems. You see this in like one city creates all the buttons in the world, right? And now it's like Hefei, Anhui is like the most amazing nuclear fusion labs, and they're training 1,000 nuclear plasma technologists. They're putting 1.5 billion per year in one city alone just to create nuclear fusion by 2050, commercially scaled nuclear fusion. This is like, Iron Man, the infinite powered cell in his suit, right? It's like Jetsons. So, but they're willing to take a bet and say it's going to be part of our national plan. So the supply chain is much more vertically integrated. So if you're starting a company, then you're going to work with private and SOEs and the government. You're going to be handed customers before you even begin, right? This is really, really important for startups, right? So I would say because of all this, China has, I'm going to call it a Jenga approach to innovation, where it takes out, dematerializes, and then it keeps building on top of that, versus a whack-a-mole approach where other countries are just like, oh, I got to do this. Oh, I got to defend on this. Oh, tariff this, whatever. So Jenga versus whack-a-mole in the long run is going to make China multi-dimensionally more successful in every single technology. And this is not something that I take pride. I want China only to win. No, China is going to take this and it's going to give a lot of it away. It's going to collaborate internationally with any country that's willing to. So I think in the long run, China's investments, China's hardships are going to benefit all the world. Thanks, Chandra.
Wonderful, Peggy. I think we've had 3 amazingly powerful perspectives and statements that help everyone understand. Before I open it up, I just want to ask you one question there in terms of, there are, in our last conference, we talked about China's sort of commitment to the shared humanity, and you've heard President Xi talk about all of this. Those who are cynical, and particularly, and unfortunately, I think at this moment, particularly in Europe and the United States, it says, oh, this is all mumbo jumbo. And you finished off by saying, this is not just about China winning. If China succeeds, it will take it to the rest of the world. Now, imagine I'm a cynic. My God, why are you saying that? What makes you believe they will do that? So in 30 seconds, 1 minute, give me an response to that.
Just for one example, China spent decades trying to create hybridized rice that would grow in salinated waters. It's like number 22 of methane, carbon emission equivalent in Project Drawdown. Okay, so it spent a lot of money, a lot of time creating this hybridized rice, but now it's working with like Dubai to plant hundreds of acres, probably thousands of acres, to feed the entire Arabian Peninsula with this rice. It's giving this technology away. It's bringing people over there to, collaborate, researchers and people who are farmers. And this is happening all across the Belt and Road with a lot of these key technologies. But China's really, really bad at English level marketing.
Absolutely. Yes.
So my lesson is dig deeper, please. And that's my job now. I travel around the world telling people these stories. So vertically integrated or vertical towers of pig farms. That's another example, right? I mean, every single thing you can think about. Nuclear fusion, ITER, right, is 35 nations collaborating together. So the key is balancing competition with collaboration, not just like, I want to win everything. That's never the philosophy that wins.
Thank you, Peggy. And Peggy, if you have a moment while you're online with us for the next, I think we have another 35 minutes or so. If you have a link to the rice farming initiative in the Middle East, please send it to us and we'll send it to everyone. Now I'm going to open it up. We've got a lot of questions coming up, but I want to give the other two speakers a chance to respond to what they've heard from the others. So Pascal, there's a lot that's been said. You talked about the blind spots. I'm not going to ask you another question about what do you think, how are Europeans going to react, but you've heard from Professor Mahoney and from Peggy. How would you respond to some of that, particularly in the context of what you already said in your opening statements? Anything you would like to share?
Sure. No, I agree with both speakers on most of the topics that were addressed. I think Professor Mahoney clearly explains very much the existential crisis that we're into these days, and that China is particularly in. And in my view, having experienced the innovation from the bottom up, I think it's not just the government, which is doing an excellent job in trying to avoid any crisis coming up, but more that from an innovation point of view, bottom up, most innovators in China have been also facing a crisis in itself. And I think we're underestimating very often how much of a survival is driving innovation and driving the change within the companies and within the entrepreneurs in China. And so, although I totally agree with Professor Mahoney that the government is really creating an enormous potential for a technology society or technological society, a very advanced society, I do believe that still that from my experience is that the power of the entrepreneurship is what drives also that potential. What I mean by that is that without these millions and millions of entrepreneurs and people who are willing to survive and to do what is necessary to grow whatever their own business is, I think the government would not have the opportunity to drive the society in itself. So it's a combination of both, and I do feel that the marriage and the working together is quite unique in China, where the local governments play an enormous role as well, which we often forget too. On the other hand, I also think when I listen to what Ms. Liu is saying, I totally agree. I mean, I love the word tornado momentum. I think that's what I've experienced, and I've been in the middle of that tornado for 25 years, so I know exactly what that means. There's a lot of momentum coming. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of ecosystem that's driving the partnerships and the collaboration. I do believe, though, the misunderstanding that many people outside China might have on is China wanting dominance or world dominance, or do they want competition with the world, has a lot to do with the fact that if you've ever competed with Chinese companies, I mean, they are very competitive. And so although it is true that it's about survival and it's about security, I think they're extremely competitive amongst themselves. And that has to do with that survival and that security, that they want to have sustainability for their own company. And so when we view it from our perspective, we view that the Chinese are so hyper competitive that they must be out for dominance. And so I think that's the mistake that we're often making, because that is where you actually see that these ecosystems is about collaboration in order to survive. And it's more about working together in order to survive, but they're still very competitive on the individual level. So I think that's something to think about. I can talk a lot more about the business model if you want me to, but I think that the real misunderstanding here in general in outside China has everything to do with the cultural background that drives China's innovation, which is different from the West. And
What
if
is
you
that,
want me, I can
Pascal,
talk
in a
about
quick,
that.
what's
Yeah.
the,
Yeah,
just
sure.
quickly in
So-
a minute.
In 1 minute, it's very simple. In Europe specifically, but also in North America, most companies that innovate have been driven by our past, our culture, which is very different from China. It's about something, it's about religion, it's about purpose, it's about doing something good, it's about being unique, it's about the enlightenment where we want to create things. It starts by the individual that wants to do something good or something greater. And because of that, we want to create what they call the blue ocean innovation, something really disruptive, really breakthroughs. While in China, if you look at their culture, and they've never been really as much influenced by the religion, it was more philosophies, not so much about the Enlightenment either. And so for them, it's much more about survival, about competition. It's about what we call a red ocean market, which it's about just making sure that, I mean, we call it in the West the art of war, but that would not make, that's not good for understanding China in itself. But it's really a competitive mindset on top of a collaboration mindset, which is in Confucianism, very much about learning, about networks, about guanxi. And then with the Taoism, of course, it's a lot about change, which Peggy Liu talked about. And so the combination of all that means that you have a very agile society in terms of innovation. And that makes us misunderstand that we believe that this agility is just because they don't want to create something long term, but it's actually a matter of survival and improving iteration by iteration. So it's a very different background. And that's why I always say they start from quantity, go to quality, and not the other way around.
Great, very, very interesting insights. Professor Mahoney, I wondered if you would like to comment on anything you heard, but also I'm interested in your take as an American about where the relationship on technology, given the tech blockade, where will we feel the turbulence beyond, what we currently see? But anything else that you heard from the other two speakers that you'd like to comment on?
Well, I am sympathetic to Pascal. I was listening to him, and I understand the challenge of trying to explain a very different way of thinking in a very succinct way. So I'm gonna try to pick up on some of the things that he was saying and discuss them in a little different way. I agree that the idea of developing technology is in part about survival. And as I said before in my opening remarks, that the need to create technology in order to compete with these advanced technological countries from the West that were bringing pressure to China starting in the 1800s, that this is what sparked a transformation. And let's recall that China, historically, we don't refer to China as a nation. A nation is a modern concept. It really starts with England, as Leah Greenfeld, one of the leading scholars on nationalism, says England is God's firstborn. And we see the rise of nationalism, capitalism, imperialism, all of these advancing, and then with it, developments in the scientific and industrial revolutions. In fact, there's a change that happens in Europe, starting in the 1200s, where we see the rise or the radicalization of a particular way of thinking. It has its roots in the Aristotelian law of non-contradiction, which stands completely opposite to the sort of the ontological principle that we find in Chinese philosophical thought, the unity of opposites, and of course the way of thinking that we see expressed best by Lao Tzu, but also permeating all the major works that have taken root in China, from Confucius to Mao Tzu to Zhuangzi, even to how Buddhism was Sinicized by reading the Lotus Sutra through Lao Tzu, as well as eventually the way the Chinese interpreted Marxism. We can go back to Mao Zedong in his two classics from 1937, the first of them on contradiction, where he adds the distinction, perhaps introduced to him by Li Dajiao, the idea that that the unity of opposites is a matter of this and that, not this or that. And this is a very important distinction that the Chinese are making relative to the Soviets, by the way. So in this case, the way the Chinese understood Marxist dialectics is much more in tandem with this older way of thinking. And of course, we can see President Xi going back to this more explicitly today with the concept of the two integrations, but also with in the context of climate change, emphasizing the first principle of Taoism, harmony between people and nature as a key value in contemporary Chinese Marxism. But I would suggest then that what we're talking about is, with the past where China had strategic vulnerabilities with respect to the technology gap, that gap has substantially closed, and now we see the U.S. moving to put pressure to try to restrict access to very specific technologies like chips and whatnot. Which would aim to re-expand that gap. I think this will ultimately fail because I think China has the capacity at this point to innovate effective solutions to these types of problems. But more importantly, because it's not really about chips, it's not really about a specific technology or specific development of AI, but how your society has emerged and developed as a technological society. But the challenge that we see, whether it was with China 2025 or other aspects, Peggy was talking about how the Chinese government has stability, it has a long-range vision. China understood that it would reach a point in its development where the United States would move into a position of resistance, that the United States would begin to try to push China back or push China down. And that we see this in tandem with what again I described as a strategic endgame directly connected to climate change. And so much of Chinese technology today is related to climate change. And so much of China's advanced technological society is about dealing with and mitigating the problems associated with climate change. Whereas the US, of course, has an economy that's a house of cards built on continuing the hegemony of the US dollar and the positive relationship with the dollar to fossil fuels. So we really see this industrial paradigm that led to the great acceleration of the Anthropocene and created all these problems. And now we see the global North trying to reposition against the global South, with China in the lead of the global South, but also one of the most vulnerable countries in the global South, and now going back and finding itself in a technology battle with these Western countries that are trying to maintain their dominance. It's not about China seeking dominance. It's about China trying to again survive this new type of existential crisis that has been foisted upon it again by the West, and that it has to solve if it wants to continue as a civilization.
Thank you, Professor. Peggy, then I've got lots of questions. Can I ask you for in 2-3 minutes to respond to it? And it sort of springs off what you already talked about: China's ability to focus, the ability to think forward, scale, and to essentially, experiment. Right? You spoke about that. So, given what both Pascal and Professor Mahoney's talked about in terms of the challenges China faces, and you talked about the political will, and that political will in a way was also tested or in display during COVID. How do you see the sort of modernization of China, which I've had also a bit of the privilege to see China modernize in such a way, especially the cities that you talk about, etc. And where does the Chinese government and the interface with the private sector come into play in terms of doing now the hard things that you, as someone who has advocated sustainability, for instance, talked about? And I'm privy to some discussions with people in China who are advising the government, for instance, the role of technology in terms of creating humongous amounts of waste with, for instance, food delivery systems, the plastics and all of that. So as someone who's always taken, a challenge and advocated the next change, how do you see all of this playing out? Because as the two speakers have said, it's survival, the scale of modernity, the crisis of modernity brings other things. And I particularly wanted your view and say, delivery systems that have created hundreds of thousands of millions of tons of waste as the next generation embraces technology and no one goes and buys food in a noodle shop anymore, or very few do.
You just covered like something I could talk 2-3 hours about.
You got 2-3 minutes, please.
Focus on the steel industry. Okay, so this is an example of where China has clearly said we're going to go carbon neutral by 2050, but China's steel industry is 17% of the nation's carbon emissions. Like if it was a country by itself, China's steel sector is the 5th largest emitter globally. That's crazy, right? So imagine you're Bao Steel and you're faced with, okay, we've got to go, we have to peak emissions and then we have to go carbon neutral, right? So it has to innovate in this case. So specifically, it's doing a lot of breakthroughs at green hydrogen, right? So using solar and wind to create hydrogen on site to create furnaces instead of those sort of, you see movies like large blast furnaces to create steel. So China has made some real great breakthroughs just recently, and Bao Steel is planning, or it has announced that it's going to go carbon neutral. I think it was like by 2055, so 5 years before China. So I think the SOEs have really no choice but to basically comply with this nation's edict of carbon neutrality. And so it's forced to innovate, but in doing so, it's creating new technologies, a whole industry of new technologies that's going to benefit, is going to be able to then sell the world. It's doing it cheaper. Ultimately, it's going to take some time to invest in these new technologies. But so I think all of China is starting to look at where can we have these win-wins, where we invest in the short term, but we're going to have multi-dimensional benefits in the long term.
Thank you, Peggy. So now we've got about 15 minutes left, and I'll just refer to some of the questions that we're getting, and it's open to all the panelists to jump in. One of the questions that's asked is, what role does the private sector in China have to play in the diffusion of these technologies? I suppose both locally, but also globally for the global good. And this tension between, will private companies be allowed to get rich first? I think this is someone from China asking this question. Will they be able to get rich first? So I'm not sure who wants to go, but Pascal, do you want to try and touch on that point? What role will the private sector have to play in the diffusion of these technologies? And is it essentially something that the state has a big say in?
Well, the private sector in China is exactly the sector that has been driving innovation in the past very much. I mean, if we can go back even to 30, 40 years or 30 years ago, Huawei was one of the first companies that went global. The issue is that most of the private sector in China in the past did not have the capacity or the resources to go global and to make an impact on a global level. And the reason was simply that the market in China was growing so fast that there was too much opportunity, but also too much risk to not be in China. If you wouldn't be in China and competing in China, you would probably not survive anywhere in the world at that point. That has changed completely, specifically with the fact that now the government is supporting technological development and going out with this technology development. The private sector is the sector that looks at these opportunities right now. I think also the Chinese economic downturn, or at least the challenges that are being faced today, is also a reason for the private sector to to look at higher quality products and higher quality markets. And that means that this will enlarge their potential to have an impact on the global level. I'm convinced that the private sector will, and you see that in the electrical vehicle market very clearly. I mean, we talk about subsidies, and they're all giving subsidies from Beijing. That's what we talk about. But the reality, look at the car companies that are really successful globally. I mean, they're almost all private companies. I mean, the most of the companies that are doing having an impact in Europe, for example, where there's a lot of debate about these subsidies now, is companies that have been driving innovation. I was visiting BYD just a couple of months ago, and they do 19 new patents every single day. Imagine 19 new patents every single day. So the competition is not anymore about just dumping products. It's about creating new technologies and new inventions. And the private sector is driving that, and the government is actually supporting that. And because of that, of course, the state-owned enterprise and the public sector is helping as well.
Thank you, Pascal. Professor Mahoney, there's a question here about overcapacity as well, and it's related to the point that Pascal just made. If you look at EV, the Europeans and the Americans are essentially taking a hard line, and the argument being that these are subsidized. But there is a school of thought, many of us would say, well, if it's good for the planet, who cares whether it's subsidized or not? It's just good for the planet. And so when you see that whole sort of argument, economic argument going, and particularly the geopolitics that's sort of embedded in it?
It's a really big question. And what I would suggest is that I think that the U.S. containment strategy against China effectively failed in 2023. And what we're just seeing is the remaining days of it. I think we're going to see Trump play a very difficult game. But I think he needs a deal with China somewhere between 12 to 18 months of taking office. He will probably pursue economic policies that focus on spending a lot of money, running up the debt, but also cutting taxes, which he'll be accommodated by the Republican Congress. But if they don't produce real results, sustainable results for the American people before the midterm elections, then the Republicans risk losing control of Congress, and Trump risks becoming a lame duck and even being abandoned by his base. Will we see a sincere effort to try to crush China once again, or will we see him trying to stack his hand for deal making? And certainly Biden is handing him a lot of cards on his way out. That said, I'd like to say that, of course, certainly we could say, well, what's good for the environment or good for the world is good for everyone. But I don't think that's really consoling for workers in northern Italy or Spain or Hungary. I think the game that Europe has been playing, at least we hope they were playing, and maybe we'll see this game come into clearer view once Trump takes office, is that they want to induce Chinese companies to invest in Europe and to build their products there. And we've seen even Trump himself kind of hinting at this. And we had heard that Harris might be open to changing some of the policies on Chinese EVs. So this may be something that we see a major change in the next year or so, if not in the next few weeks, although I doubt we should be that optimistic. Now, I would like to make one more quick point, and that is, there's sort of an obscure reference, a point raised by the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek in a reflection on the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. He suggested that while we tend to normalize the idea that the Soviets tried to accelerate historical developments, we might also see that in some cases they tried to slow them down. And here Zizek isn't thinking about how the Soviets began to stagnate politically and economically during the Cold War. What he means is that period of relative chaos that created opportunities for the revolution in 1917, where historical developments might be understood as moving too quickly, and how the Bolsheviks were able to get them under control, slow them down, and reestablish a more manageable but still accelerated pace of change. Now, we can well understand today that China as we mentioned several times, still lags in some areas of scientific and technological development. And while in some cases these are not insignificant, they are not the yawning gaps that produce the sort of security risks that China experienced in the past. Furthermore, we know that the government believes these gaps can be managed and further narrowed with the right investment and management strategies. Nevertheless, where we see limits being posed in some cases are regulations related to AI, fintech platforms, and so on, that to a significant extent have curtailed the arrival of oligopolies outside of state control. If we compare Alibaba's net worth, 290 or 239.83 billion to Amazon, 2.17 trillion. We see the former is only 20% of the latter. In short, we see that a large Chinese technological firm has been unable to dictate economic terms to the Chinese government. And this was a concern, if we recall, a few years ago. And in contrast, we see precisely that problem happening in the American tech oligarchy. Instead, we see that in China, technology competition remains robust. Perhaps this explains why Pinduoduo has now eclipsed Taobao as an online platform. That said, I'd like to go back to finally to this point raised by Pascal and his defense of the private sector. We know that last year during the third plenum, we saw a very sort of decisive answer to an age-old question about what would be the role of state-owned enterprises going forward, with this understanding that there was always or had long been this need to reform them. And would we reform them in a way that would ultimately privilege the private sector? And what the political system has determined is that those state-owned enterprises have been instrumental in saving China in the wake of 2008 and again in 2020, and that they play a very important stabilizing role in the Chinese economy. At the same time, it also made it clear that the private sector does play a very vital role, and that these two sectors have to learn to work together in ways where they're not involved in zero-sum competition. But this is also, I think, acknowledging what many experts and what Pascal has said, that we anticipate the leading technology advancements will come from the private sector, or in some of these firms that are partly state-owned and partly private. And again, that we see this also in the third plenum, where it's anticipated that Chinese tech firms can be employed to help upgrade and improve the technological capacity of the state-owned enterprises, and that this will be a new way for them to move forward.
Thank you, Professor Mahoney. A few minutes left. Peggy, a question for you from the audience. How can developing countries where China has strong commercial relationships as part of the Belt and Road avoid losing out when choosing Chinese technology solutions or collaboration? For instance, if they they can be confronted and penalized by anti-China soft sanctions.
Yeah, I was literally just talking to about 40 Chilean CEOs, and they asked the same question. And I have two examples of how other countries, other companies can collaborate with China, even in this very hostile geopolitical environment. One is, think about the supply chain in China as thousands of companies working together to create a finished product. And think, for example, an electric vehicle, right? It's not just BYD, but it's thousands of companies that create the wheels, the screws, the motors, etc. So think about if you're a Chilean company and you are able to partner with the right supply chain companies to create your own local Chilean car brand, your own local LSEV, low-speed electric vehicle in, let's say, Italy, right? So I think Europe invented little tiny cars, right? Now you can create your LSEV, right? Electric tiny car, with the help of China's supply chain. So that's how you win, number one. And number two is, I think there's a huge opportunity globally to collaborate on disaster response. I mean, I think we know this is going to increase like a tornado, so to speak, right? It's just going to get worse. And so we have to learn how to collaborate in disaster response. And there's only win-win.
Thank you.
So those are my two answers.
Wonderful.
And I hope
Wonderful.
somebody.
I love the point about, also focusing on the fact, particularly given what's going on in the LA area, on China's ability to also respond and cooperate globally. So we have literally about 3-4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you all to provide some gold dust for the audience in about 30 seconds or 1 minute. What would you want an international audience that's listening to you to take away and put away and think about carefully when we discuss China's technological advancement, its innovation model and philosophy? I know, Pascal, we didn't have time to get into the model and all of that, but I hope you feel satisfied with we talked enough. But in 30 seconds or a minute, please, what is the one thing you would like an international audience to take away on this topic to further cooperation and global understanding? Pascal.
So in my view, yeah, thank you, Chandran. In my view, I think I started with the blind spots, and I think we need to get away from these blind spots, meaning we need to look at the entrepreneurs doing things. We need to look at how they're building quality. We need to get away from just having the idea that the economy is the reason why China will not innovate. And I always say, I mean, China has learned from the West for 30, 40 years. We have learned very little from China. And the world right now sees that the model of China, whether it's what Professor Mahoney says from this top down, but also the whole strategic technological advantage that China has from a policy point of view, as well as from what Ms. Liu said, very much about the change and the ecosystems and so on. All these models, which is culturally embedded, is something that we can learn a lot from, but we're not doing it very much. And that's because we have, as I say, a blind spot on Beijing is up to no good. And because of that mindset that we don't see the good that is happening from the other side.
Wonderful, Pascal. Thank you so much. Professor Mahoney.
Well, I do think we live in an era of great power competition. I don't think this is something that China is responsible for starting, although I do think China plays an instrumental role in creating an alternative to Western paradigms of domination, and that China is really the only country in the world that is capable of providing that alternative. And that alternative it touches very directly on core issues like climate change, like pandemics, like these sorts of issues. I think the other thing is, I talk about China's rise as an advanced technological society and that there's something very unique about the political system. And then in turn, they create a number of products, smart cities, smart ports, all these things that can go out and serve different countries in the world so they can improve their own capacities, so that they can also participate in the global economy and not simply be kept stuck in these old development traps. But the key point is China doesn't want to rule the world. China doesn't want to take responsibility for your country's problems. It isn't satisfied. It's never satisfied with the extent to which it's able to address its own problems. It's much more in tune with how does it solve its problems. And Peggy made this comment earlier that China does a really terrible job communicating itself to the world. I would qualify that and say, of course, it doesn't help that the U.S. spends $1 billion a year, creating false messages. But when China communicates, it's largely communicating to itself. It's communicating to its own people, and it understands through its own exceptional political system. And I don't mean exceptional in terms of greater than others, but in terms of its own exceptional system. It's not suitable. It's not suitable to rule the Philippines or Vietnam or any place else. That's whereas the U.S. has this universal model of a certain type of democracy that they believe that they can export anywhere. China says, no, our system is particular to ourselves, and we're going to do this and take care of us. So you guys take care of yourself, and if we can work together in a way that benefits both sides, great, let's do that. And that's a very different development paradigm and very different vision of global international relations and foreign policy. And it's directly threatening to the U.S. model. So
yes, very, very important point, Professor Mahoney. Peggy, over to you. I've got only like less than a minute, please. Thank you.
Professor Mahoney, and I'm going to give a more spiritual comment to close and talk about how, everybody in your world is a mirror of yourself, right? And I think a large source of the geopolitical issues between US and China is that the US looks at China as it acts. So for example, the Reagan-inspired Gallagher-Puttinger playbook for US-China relations, quote, says the US shouldn't manage competition with China, it should win it. What would winning look like? Well, China's rulers would find inspiration to explore new models of development and governance that don't rely on repression at home and compulsive hostility abroad. It would give up trying to prevail in a hot or cold conflict with the United States and its friends. So I'm reading this, living in the nation of Hawaii, and this month, The Atlantic is talking about the Hawaiians who want their nation back, talking about how in 1893, the US did a coup of the Kingdom of Hawaii and literally annexed a kingdom to be a US state in 1893. So I think part of it is just like China is about non-interference, as Professor Mahoney said, but the US is about winning. And so we have to sort of stop judging each other on as a mirror of ourselves and somehow find harmony.
Thank you. That's a great way to end the discussion around harmony. And I would just say, when we talk about technology, and I can't resist saying this, we always talk about tech, EVs. And I always remember going to China 30 years ago, and people used to laugh about the toilets. I keep reminding people that the most important technology going forward in my part of the world, even Southeast Asia, is toilets. And the way China has been able to essentially implement sewer systems in the most remote parts, I went to last year in Guangzhou, etc., is technological innovation. But it is technological innovation that brings all the things you all talked about, which is the ability of the state, the people, to mobilize the people and to bring a vision and that scalability as well. So I just want to remind people who are listening that toilets is part of technology too, and my God, the world needs a lot of them as well. So everyone, on that note, to our panelists, Pascal, Professor, and Peggy, thank you so much. I think this was a wonderful discussion, and we have a very, very important session coming up. And I will now hand panel that starts after a little break. I'm going to hand back to our Master of Ceremonies, Elaine. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care of yourselves.
thank you.